in Wisconsin, estimates are that the Democratic Party would have to win by over 20%, by a 20-point margin, in order to take back the legislative majority.
Welcome to the Democracy Podcast. I'm Henry.
And I'm Jesse, and today we're going to talk a little bit about the redistricting process and gerrymandering, and how gerrymandering threatens to undermine our democracy. If we want to talk a little bit about just what the redistricting process is and why we do that.
Sure. So every 10 years, the Constitution requires a census, which is an official count and survey of the population that gathers demographic details about individuals living in the country. It lets us see which states and cities are shrinking and which are growing, and we use that data to undergo the redistricting process to make sure that our legislative districts are representing similarly populated areas. This isn't similar amounts of registered voters, but similar numbers of people, which includes children, non-citizens, felons, and other people who can't or don't vote. And it upholds the one person, one unit of representation principle by preventing smaller groups of people from receiving outstanding representation in Congress and state legislative bodies than larger groups might otherwise. Jesse, do you want to tell us about the Permanent Apportionment Act of 1929?
Yeah, so today redistricting is mostly governed by the Permanent Apportionment Act of 1929. And the basics of that is it just sets up a formula based around census population numbers for what states get what amount of House districts. And it also sets the total number of districts at 435. So in redistricting, the number of districts don't increase, but some states will lose districts while others will gain them. So that is how the redistricting process works, which brings us to gerrymandering. Now, ideally, redistricting would be done in a way that is totally nonpartisan, non-political, where you're drawing districts based around concrete communities of interest, and where you're not trying to provide any party or any race or any religious group or anyone else a political benefit. However, in most states, the state legislatures get to do the redistricting. They will draw and vote on to approve the new maps. And as you can imagine, especially today in our highly polarizing times, many state legislators are drawing maps that are for partisan benefit or other benefit. The reality is there's two actually main types of gerrymandering that we see today and see throughout history. One is gerrymandering around race, where they're trying to minimize the power of a racial minority or enhance the power of the racial majority. And then, of course, we also see partisan gerrymandering around just trying to benefit a certain political party, usually the political party that controls the state legislature. And within that as well, there's also some of incumbent protection in gerrymandering, where, especially for the state legislature will draw the districts in ways that the incumbents like their districts and think they can win them and are benefiting themselves. And that is obviously tied in with partisan gerrymandering, but is a unique effect in of itself. So gerrymandering is the purposeful drawing of the lines to benefit a specific political party, racial group, or other political entity beyond just thinking about how to put together a fair and representative map.
We've heard a lot about gerrymandering in the last few election cycles, but gerrymandering's been around for, more than 200 years at this point. Do you want to give us some historical examples of the first instances of gerrymandering?
Yeah, so looking at the U.S. history, gerrymandering has been with us basically from the beginning. So what is often cited as the first instance of gerrymandering for the U.S. House is right at the beginning when the first congressional districts for the House were drawn. The former governor of Virginia, Patrick Henry, he did not want James Madison to be in the Congress. He worked with his legislative allies to deny Madison being appointed to the Senate, which is what he sought first, because at that time, the state legislatures elected senators. And so then Madison decided to run for the House, and Henry worked with his legislative allies in the state legislature of Virginia to draw Madison into a district that would have more anti-federalist voters, they thought, and also specifically included James Monroe's home in the same district as James Madison's, so that those two would have to run against each other, with the idea being that Monroe was also a big name, popular politician. Now, in the end, Madison actually beat Monroe in that first election. So I think it's very telling that the first example of drawing a district to favor, disfavor a certain person or party failed. But it was something people were immediately thinking about, like, how can I use this power of drawing these districts to favor people I like and disfavor people I don't like. Now, of course, even more famous than that example is the example of Elbridge Gerry. Now, Elbridge Gerry, his last name is spelled Gerry, so he was often pronounced Jerry instead of Gary, but it's actually pronounced Gary. And that is where the word gerrymandering comes from. It's his name and mander from salamander, because in 1812, in the redistricting that happened prior to that year, Elbridge Gerry and his political party controlled the Massachusetts state legislature. They were the Democratic Republicans, and they drew districts to favor themselves, and they drew at least one state senate district that sort of snaked around a bunch of towns and looked vaguely like a salamander. And that was coined as the term a gerrymander by the press at the time. And interestingly, Elbridge Gerry would lose the governor's election in 1812, but his party would maintain control of the state senate that they had just gerrymandered. So that is the story of Elbridge Gerry and where the term gerrymandering comes from.
That's really interesting. I think people hear the word gerrymandering and everybody the first time they hear it thinks that's a weird word. And it's because it's Gary plus salamander. Absolutely bizarre. So the state of modern gerrymandering, I think, is something that we want to focus on primarily. We don't want to go through 200 years of people redrawing maps every 10 years, because I think when we think about gerrymandering, the year 2010 is something that we tend to focus on, because it's when gerrymandering starts to get like extra effective and aggressive as performed by the Republican Party. So do we want to talk just a little bit about what the post-2010 House looked like, and why gerrymandering really became such an important political issue in the last decade and some change?
Yeah, so to rewind back to the 2010, political, what was happening in politics then, the Republicans had one of their best elections that year because it was the first midterm under Obama. Obamacare had passed, but was still unpopular. The economy was not doing great. So they won back the House of Representatives by a huge margin. But most importantly, they won lots of state legislatures that they had not controlled before, as well as governors, including critically, and I'll talk more about this later, governorships in places like Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. And so what this meant was that in 2011, as redistricting was being done, Republicans controlled a lot more states, and they were able to draw the maps entirely themselves. And in addition to that, In 2010 and 2011, we had a lot of modern computing technology that made gerrymandering much more effective. And we also were much more polarized by that point than we'd been in prior eras. And so both of those factors made it a lot easier to draw aggressive gerrymanders. And then the fact that Republicans controlled a lot more states gave them the ability to just draw a lot more districts for the House of Representatives. And so that resulted in the 2012 election, Democrats got more votes for the House of Representatives at a national level, but Republicans still controlled the House of Representatives because the districts had been drawn in so many states to favor them.
So 3 states we want to talk about specifically that in 2020 we think about as swing states, and in 2010 we also thought about as swing states, are Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. So after the 2010 election, all 3 of those states moved to full Republican control, which let the state legislatures, led by Republicans, redraw those districts. And they did so in a very aggressive fashion. Jesse, do you want to talk a little bit about those 3 states?
Yeah, so in addition to the U.S. House, redistricting affects state legislatures. So the state legislature will be redistricted as well. And with Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, all of those are, swing states. Historically were a little more blue at that time, but they had in the 2010 Republican wave year elected Republican governors and Republican state legislatures who were able to then draw the maps themselves. And while they gerrymandered aggressively for the U.S. House, they were even more aggressive in their gerrymandering of the state legislature. And I think this is best demonstrated by looking at the 2018 elections. So in 2018, that was a wave year for Democrats where they did very well. They won every statewide election in all 3 of those states in 2018. But they didn't win back control of any of the state legislatures. And the reason for that is entirely due to gerrymandering. If we look at the state of Michigan, and we look at the House of Representatives of Michigan, in the 2018 election, Democrats got 52% of the vote. They got 2,128,000 votes versus Republicans who got 47.4% of the vote, and they had 1,935,000 votes. So Democrats got almost 200,000 more votes. But in terms of the seats, Republicans still held 58 seats to Democrats' 52, so Republicans still had the majority even after Democrats did almost 5 percentage points better and almost 200,000 votes ahead. Then if you look at the Wisconsin State Assembly in 2018, Democrats got about 53% of the vote. Republicans got about 44.75%, and that in terms of total votes was 1,306,000 for the Democrats and 1,103,000 for the Republicans. So a little over 200,000 more voters in Wisconsin in 2018 cast their ballots for Democrats for the Wisconsin State Assembly. But in that district, Republicans hold 63 of the seats to Democrats' 36. So they're only a few seats short of a 2/3 majority, even while only getting less than 45% of the vote, and while losing by hundreds of thousands of votes to the Democrats in that election. And then finally, in Pennsylvania in 2018, Democrats for the Pennsylvania House of Representatives got 55% of the vote to about 44.4% of the vote for Republicans. And so the vote totals were Democrats had 2,568,000 to Republicans 2,075,000. So close to 500,000 more Pennsylvanians voted for Democrats in the 2018 Pennsylvania House of Representatives elections, but the majority was still held by Republicans, with them having 110 seats to 93 seats for the Democrats. And I know in Wisconsin, estimates are that the Democratic Party would have to win by over 20%, by a 20-point margin, in order to take back the legislative majority. So what that really shows is just the power of gerrymandering. And gerrymandering is more powerful at the state legislative level because it's all done by one state legislature, as opposed to at the federal level where it's a mix of different state legislatures, and some are always going to be controlled by Democrats, some will always be controlled by Republicans. And this is really the key point, is that those states are really not democratic with their existing maps. There's no way for the popular will to be translated into a legislative majority in those states, at least for the Democratic Party. And that is just not what a democracy is supposed to be. There's no way for people to hold their politicians accountable under that scenario. There's no way for people to change the policies and the direction of their state under that scenario.
Why is this legal? Why is there a state in the US where Democrats could would have to win an election by 20 points to gain control of the legislature? I would assume that the parties in those states and individuals have sued. I'm sure that this has gone to the Supreme Court before. And what's the Supreme Court said about gerrymandering in this process? Is there a difference between racial versus partisan gerrymandering? And you know, why going into 2020, another census year, hasn't this been corrected?
Yeah, so that is a good question. How can this happen? How is this legal? So there is no constitutional language that explicitly addresses the drawing of district maps for, any particular partisan gain or other gain like that. So there's nothing explicitly in the Constitution about this issue. And the Supreme Court ruled just last year in 2020, and I believe this was a 5-4 decision, that partisan gerrymandering is not something the federal courts can review or do anything about. And there's a very twisted logic to this where they say it's a political question, and so the courts should stay out of it and defer to the political branches. And that's a long-standing legal concept that in general, if things are political questions, the court should defer as much as possible to Congress and to state legislatures and things like that. But the problem, of course, with that is that in this case, you have districts where there is no political solution, where you can't just be like, well, we're going to elect the other party next time and not do gerrymandering, or we're going to elect these great reformers, because they've drawn the districts specifically to elect themselves. Now, there have been prior court decisions that have limited gerrymandering in certain ways. For instance, as you mentioned, there is the one person, one unit of representation rule. That comes from a 1960s Supreme Court decision. So districts cannot be different sizes. They have to be roughly the same size for both state legislatures and the Congress. But they can be drawn to benefit a political party. Now, the Voting Rights Act also bans racial gerrymandering, and it has language limiting that. And so you can sue in federal court to say, this district or these entire set of maps that a state put up are designed to limit the power of some protected minority, most typically Black voters in the South. And courts can and have forced redistricting upon states and forced them to redo their maps because of that. That said, with the 2013 court ruling that removed the pre-clearance requirements, states can draw their maps however they want, and then they will get sued after the maps come into effect. It used to be, at least for the states in the South and other jurisdictions that were under pre-clearance, that the DOJ would have to approve their districts, just like they would have to approve any other changes to voting laws. So that has made us more vulnerable today. And that's actually a new thing, that this redistricting cycle will be the first one without any Voting Rights Act pre-clearance protections.
So just to get this straight, being a Democrat or a Republican is not a protected group. So the court has basically set a precedent that if it doesn't relate to a discrimination against a protected group, then the court is going to say that is a political decision and they're not going to interfere.
Correct. Now that is for federal courts. Every state has their own state courts. States also have their own constitution. So I expect we will see a lot of, and we've seen this before, lawsuits in state court citing that certain maps violate state constitutions. And I know some state constitutions even have certain fairness requirements and things like that for redistricting. So there is still state courts as a potential avenue of legal redress for this, but the federal courts will not stop partisan gerrymandering. That said, there will probably be federal court cases around racial gerrymandering. And I think that is also an issue where it's almost impossible to disentangle, in that gerrymandering to reduce the power of the Democratic Party and gerrymandering to reduce Black voters' power is very hard. It's very hard for those to be different things, particularly in southern states with large Black populations, because Black voters are the majority in many cases, and certainly a large plurality of the Democratic Party in those states. And so what's going to happen is a lot of places will say, oh, we're doing partisan gerrymandering. We just happen to kind of disenfranchise these Black voters or limit their power, but it's purely partisan and not racial at all, because a racial gerrymander can be struck down, whereas a partisan one cannot be by the federal courts, at least currently.
And would you assume that with the makeup of the Supreme Court right now, that those arguments might land, that you'll be able to get up in front of the Supreme Court and say, well, we're just discriminating based on political party, and that the racial gerrymandering is secondary to the political gerrymandering, and that might hold water in the Supreme Court?
Yeah, with a 6-3 Republican majority on the Supreme Court, that is quite likely that a lot of gerrymanders will get upheld in federal court, even when there's clearly a racial dynamic to them. And obviously, none of us here are lawyers, but understanding just the partisan nature of court decisions in recent years, that seems particularly likely. And of course, John Roberts could have ruled with the Liberals in 2020 to set a precedent of partisan gerrymandering, is off limits, or there are at least some restrictions on it. But that is not, of course, what happened.
And without that federal court intervention, it makes it really, really hard for voters in places like Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania to have any sort of recourse in ungerrymandering their states. Like, once it happens and it gets locked in, without federal intervention, it becomes really difficult and time-consuming to change the maps. So, you might never get there to change the maps, but at the very least, the maps are going to go into effect and operate for, a year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, depending on how long the legislation gets drawn out. And the side that's benefiting from the gerrymandering is incentivized to make that court case last as long as possible. So at the very least, we can focus with the state court intervention on preventing states from becoming more gerrymandered. But once it's in place, it's very difficult to undo until the next round of redistricting.
Yeah. And so it's worth thinking a little bit about what's going to happen in the upcoming redistricting. So here are some things that are different in 2020 than in 2010. So one thing is that Democrats have a slightly better hand. They control more governorships and more state legislatures than they did in 2010. So that will make things a little bit less even, or a little bit more even relative to 2010. But at the same time, there's still a lot of big states where Republicans will get to draw all the districts. And many of those are southern states that in the past would have been under pre-clearance, but today are not. And most estimates are that Republicans are going to get to draw solely on their own 183 districts. Whereas Democrats are only going to get to draw about 75 in 2021, meaning even if Democrats aggressively gerrymander the states they have, on net, Republicans will still gain a lot of seats through gerrymandering.
So we've talked a little bit about how courts are not going to step in and save us from gerrymandering. So what are the solutions that might help us in this next round of redistricting?
Yeah, so gerrymandering, because of how extreme it was in 2010, in the 2010 redistricting cycle, has gotten a lot more attention this past decade, and a lot of activists and people have been calling for solutions. And one thing that has become a common way to try and address this is what's called an independent redistricting commission. So that's where you set up a commission that will actually draw the lines and enact them rather than the normal legislature just doing that. And those commissions have been set up by some state legislatures, and they've been set up by ballot initiatives as well. So there's one in Michigan, which is a very gerrymandered state that we've talked about. And so that will have 13 commissioners picked at random from a pool of folks who have applied. And there'll be 4 Democrats, 4 Republicans, and 5 independents. And they'll be responsible for drawing the lines for both the state legislature and the U.S. House of Representatives. And they have certain criteria they're supposed to meet around fairness and compactness and all those sorts of things. So the hope is, and we haven't seen that many independent redistricting commissions actually go through a full cycle. There have been a few that were around in 2010. And generally, they did draw much fairer maps than elsewhere. So those are a potential solution to partisan gerrymandering, to have a commission where there's a set mix of people from across the political spectrum and where they all have to agree and create a set of fair maps. Now, so far, all the solutions to gerrymandering have been mostly state-by-state things where you're changing the process in one state, either through ballot initiative or through a state legislature. And that approach has by and large failed. And the reason for that is it's disproportionately blue states that are enacting independent redistricting commissions. You do have a few swing states like Michigan that have done it by ballot initiative, but by and large, Republicans have really tried to defeat these initiatives because they know how powerful gerrymandering can and has been for them to expand their power. And they've shown much less commitment to the principle of democracy and democratic equality in recent years than the Democratic Party. And so part of the reason that Democratic state legislatures are only going to have about 75 districts where they can draw on a partisan basis the district maps is because a lot of big blue states like New York and California have a form of independent redistricting commissions. And so that can actually, and may end up resulting in the federal level House being more skewed than it would be otherwise, because if Democrats gerrymandered very heavily in big blue states like California, that could offset some of the gerrymandering Republicans will do in Texas. But the better solution would be to just have a federal level standard for gerrymandering. And thankfully, the Constitution does give the Congress a lot of power over our elections and redistricting. And so the Congress can establish that. And there's a bill to do it. You may have heard of it before. It's H.R. 1 or the For the People Act, or S1 in the Senate. And part of that bill would be a requirement that states establish independent redistricting commissions, and it sets out some requirements on those. Though that would not take effect until the 2030 redistricting, but it would have plain language. It states specifically, the redistricting plan enacted by a state shall not, when considered on a statewide basis, be drawn with the intent or the effect of unduly favoring or disfavoring any political party. So that would come into effect immediately, and that would reopen federal level courts, because you can now say this violates the For the People Act section on the redistricting plan if a map is drawn for partisan reasons. So passing that section of the For the People Act is incredibly important. In fact, David Shore, who's a data analyst who looked at the impact of voter suppression and gerrymandering on actual election results, thinks that the impact of gerrymandering will be 5 times the impact of any other reform in H.R. 1 in terms of making political power be more aligned with the actual vote results.
There is a problem, though, in that in order to pass H.R. 1 in the Senate, that it was going to require 60 votes. H.R. 1 is very clearly not a reconciliation bill. There's very little that you could do. No work that I've seen so far to try to recreate some of these types of provisions that are in H.R. 1 into like tax penalties or some way to like force states financially to adhere to these sorts of rules. So in all likelihood, you're going to need 60 votes in the Senate, which, as we know, Democrats control 50 seats. Republicans are not at all on board with this provision of H.R. 1 or H.R. 1 as a whole. So that gets us back to our favorite conversation, which is the filibuster.
Yeah, so there are a couple flaws with this plan. The first one is just getting it passed. And you will hear us talk a lot on this podcast, most likely, about the need to reform or eliminate the filibuster in order to pass voting rights legislation. And most crucial to that is these anti-gerrymandering provisions of the For the People Act. Fortunately, Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, moderate Democratic senators, have not been on board with getting rid of or modifying the filibuster in a way to allow a bill like this to pass with a simple majority. even though that would be completely constitutional and not all that out of the ordinary for American politics.
And nonpartisan.
Yes. Yeah, and this bill is often painted as, like a Democratic power grab, but it's really a small d Democratic power grab. It shifts power back to the people. It makes our system more democratic, and it wouldn't favor Democrats at all in a world where Republicans are winning more votes. It would favor Democrats in the world we have now, where Republicans are winning elections in certain cases while getting fewer votes. So, yeah, we will talk more about that in other episodes about why the filibuster needs to be changed and what we can do about that. But yeah, unless that is changed, we're not going to get 10 Republicans on board with this type of plan because they're benefiting so much from gerrymandering. And the second flaw with this plan is that it cannot address state legislative gerrymandering. The federal Constitution gives Congress a lot of power over federal elections and the U.S. House of Representatives, but it doesn't give it much power over state legislative elections. And so states would be required to use independent redistricting commissions and follow these guidelines when drawing U.S. House districts, but they could still gerrymander at the state legislative level. And one thing that we're going to see most likely happen in the next year is these showdowns, particularly in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, where you have the gerrymandered Republican legislatures. They will try and draw gerrymandered maps for Republicans. And then those will go to the governors who are Democrats who will veto them. And most likely what will end up happening is the state courts will have to draw the maps because there will be no agreement. It's technically possible for the Republican legislatures to sit down and work with the Democrats and draw a fair map.
Good luck.
But I don't think that is possible. And in Pennsylvania, the state Supreme Court leans towards more the Democrats. But in Wisconsin, it's the opposite. So, yeah, it's a really big question of what will end up happening there. And because there may be no maps at all, federal courts could potentially still intervene in that scenario. But that is a big question. And that's really the only way to undo some of this gerrymandering is the Republicans in those states have their legislative majorities, not because they won more votes in recent elections, but because they had gerrymandered those districts so badly in the 2010 redistricting cycle that now they still control them even after losing the popular vote in recent elections for the legislature. And of course, Democrats were able to win at the statewide level because you can't gerrymander, at least so far you've not been able to gerrymander a gubernatorial election. And so we'll have to see how that plays out. And that will be a big question for the state of our democracy, because right now, those three states, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. And Michigan will be a different process because it now has that independent redistricting commission. So it'll be a big test of how well that works and if they're able to get fair maps there. And if we see, fair maps in 2022 with the party that wins the most votes winning the most political power, that will be a very good sign for the effectiveness of independent redistricting commissions moving forward.
I think it's really important as we end this conversation to touch back on something that you mentioned earlier, that Democrats are generally in favor of putting into place independent redistricting commissions. But that if that fails to be passed through Congress and become law nationwide, that we end up in a situation where the Democrats are at a disadvantage against Republicans by upholding the value of democracy. The way that they could compete would be to have both parties engaged in partisan gerrymandering across the country and basically both be in violation of the democratic process. And that in order for there to be a fair fight between Democrats and Republicans and to achieve our highest standard of democracy, especially moving into the upcoming redistricting process as computer technology continues to advance, and these models are easier and easier to build and manipulate, and when partisan gerrymandering, at least right now, has been given a green light by the Supreme Court, that this is something that requires urgent intervention if we're going to, maintain democratic ideals.
Yeah, so I think from a practical perspective, the best thing that could happen is for the For the People Act, or at least a version of it containing the anti-gerrymandering provisions, to be passed immediately, because that would ensure there's fair maps everywhere. And remember, that would restrict both Democrats and Republicans from gerrymandering in their states. And that is an important note, is that Democrats, of course, have gerrymandered states like Illinois and Maryland in the past, but they've never gerrymandered to the extent that the Republicans did in 2010. And part of that is, of course, a lack of power. Part of that is also just geographics. Democrats are packed heavily in cities, which makes it harder for them to gerrymander as effectively as Republicans. And I will say, a lot of people out there will say that even under fair maps, Republicans would have an edge because of how they're distributed. And while there's an argument to be made for that, the reality is if you actually wanted to draw maps that are highly likely to result in the party that wins the most votes, wins the most seats, you can do that. Like, it's very possible to get the alignment very close there. It's not necessarily going to line up every time when there's a very close election, but you certainly can make it so that whenever a political party wins by more than a full percentage point, whether at the national level with the U.S. House or any state legislative level with state legislatures, that party ends up getting the majority. And that is something we should really be targeting and demanding that legislatures do, and that the redistricting process results in. Because, districts that are drawn for partisan gain really undermine the fundamentals of our democracy and can create these sort of nightmare scenarios like in Wisconsin, where one political party is locked out of power in the legislature for a decade at least, even when they are winning more votes and have more support in the state.
Thank you for listening to the Democracy Podcast. If you enjoyed the episode, please subscribe. We'd love to hear your feedback. And we'll be in your feed shortly with an episode about voter fraud.